Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, it is both a pleasure and a privilege to be able to welcome you here to Davos for the second consecutive year. Last year I emphasized your dynamism and your capacity for innovation, and these two qualities are more necessary than ever to resolve the problems and face the challenges of the modern world. I could also add a third quality, an unfailing will to make France's voice heard amongst the community of nations, to see it more involved in the multilateral fora, of which the World Economic Forum is one example. You said last year that you would return to Davos. Mr. President, you have been true to your word. But it is also, and above all, the President of the G8 and the G20 that we are welcoming here today. It is an immense task which is facing you, and as you yourself emphasized on Monday at Paris at your press conferences, there's no shortage of challenges. However, you have chosen, and you will explain this to us in a moment, to focus on three subjects which concern us here. For example, monetary imbalances, the issue of volatility of commodities, and the matter of reforming global governance. You can rest assured that you can rely on all of the participants at this summit in Davos and the entirety of the communities of the World Economic Forum to nourish your reflection and the debates in order to find together tangible and innovative solutions. And it is in this spirit that the World Economic Forum, together with the Chamber of Commerce and in cooperation with employers' organizations, is at your disposal for this process. Mr. President, this session will be divided into two parts. First of all, we will hear you speak to us and outline your current policy. And in the second part, as is a tradition here at Davos, we will have an open dialogue moderated by Maurice, Lévy, who is a member of the World Economic Forum Foundation, with a number of individuals from the audience as well. And this dialogue will be oriented around the priorities that you outlined during your press conference on Monday for the initiation of the presidency of the G8 and the G20. Once again, thank you for having replied so willingly to our invitation. It is a genuine pleasure to have you amongst us here today, Mr. President of the Republic.
Cher Professeur Schwab, merci.
My dear friend Professor Schwab, thank you for having honored me by inviting me today. My dear Maurice Lévy, thank you for giving such an internationally positive image of France. Ladies and gentlemen, I had indeed promised that I would return. But frankly, this wasn't the most difficult promise I've had to keep. Especially with such exceptional weather as we're enjoying today here. But above all, it seemed very important for me to be here because there are financial and economic actors from all over the world. And I have a message to put across. The issues we have to tackle are of such complexity, are of such difficulty, are so numerous that we must, at all costs, refrain from getting bogged down in misunderstandings or ideological disputes. I would even go so far as to say that we must refrain from reacting, all of us, simply by virtue of the way we were taught to think in the 20th century, because things have moved on. These are no longer ideologies that apply. Let us indeed look to tangible, concrete results. Let us come up with new ideas and new solutions to issues which are unprecedented in their complexity and scope. Let us put our heads together to think about these solutions, to come up with these solutions, because there is no one here, and there is no one sitting at the G20 table who could go it alone, who could even imagine that they could roll up their sleeves and solve single-handedly the kind of problems that we're facing. Forgive me for saying this. These are no empty words. These are things I deeply, passionately believe. Now, I read in the world's press, as it is my duty so to do, what positions are adopted by this, that, or the head of state or government, or others. But let us stop reacting on the spur of the moment. Let us, for instance, stop looking at the differences between Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world. Let us stop talking in terms of the North-South divide, between the rich country, poor country divide. Let us try and take a different approach, adopt a different angle. Now, the second preliminary remark I wish to make is that last year I had spoken very freely, very openly, because I spoke as President of the French Republic. And of course, as President of the G8 and of the G20, will be as open, as free. However, I must also and equally take account of people's red lines, people's interests. And the objective of the French presidency of the G8 and G20 is to try and bring about a convergence between people on the world scene who must learn to talk to one another and to listen to one another and to understand one another. So all that I must say, all that I must do, must be said and done and put at the service of this collective common interest. Third comment. Last year, we were pulling out of an unprecedented crisis. And the forecasts were hugely pessimistic, remember? For 2010. Now, let us try and keep a cool head here and look calmly at the difference between what had been forecast and what actually happened. I'm not being harsh on those who made these forecasts. I know how difficult their task is. I must say, I would like to pay a special tribute to them insofar as they seem to be capable of revising their forecasts. I wish we could revise our commitments and pledges. Anyway, for 2010, the forecasters have the possibility of reviewing, revising, updating their forecast up until November 2010. Which is just basically on the brink of the end of the year. Otherwise, what would have been the point, since we have the actual results? What had they forecast? A double dip? Well, there was no double dip. What we've seen is world growth in the order of 5%. I was looking at the figures. Over the last 10 years, the average world growth rate was 3.5%. Now, I'm not saying that we've put the crisis behind us once and for all. There's still much too much unemployment. among, in particular, young people and the over 50s. There are still a lot of risks that need to be overcome. However, let's call a spade a spade. We've got a 5% growth rate throughout the world. No, it is not spread evenly from one country to another, but that is already a lot. Even the most serious polls imagined a bad year for 2010, a bleak year even. And that is not what has happened. And ultimately, I cannot prevent myself from thinking that the fact of coordinating the financial and monetary or economic policies among the members of the G20 that didn't exist 2 years ago. Remember, 2 years ago, there was no mention of the G20. It's the newest, youngest of the international organizations. But anyway, the very fact that 20 countries, well, in fact, 25, because there are 25 who actually around the table, coordinate their policies. And insofar as they represent 85% of world GDP, that coordination, the very fact of having coordinated, was of the essence. It was vital. It was that ability to coordinate that made it possible to put an end to the crisis or to avoid it simply boiling on. And it is this coordination we have to strengthen, deepen, protect, and that is what we are determined to focus on. Fourth point. Over the past 2 years, well, let's say 18 months, the proceedings and the work of the G20, and this may shock you, have been relatively easy because we didn't have the choice. We didn't have any choice because we were standing on the brink of the precipice. I mean, either we took the decisions we needed to take or the whole thing imploded. Now, it's now that the going gets tougher, because some may imagine that we have a matter of choice, which is not my view, and if you like, I'll explain why I say this. But there is where the risk lies, because the legitimacy of the G20 depends exclusively on its ability to take decisions. A G20 that doesn't take any decisions is a G20 that loses its legitimacy. And some, in all good faith, may imagine that the worst of the crisis is behind us, and that we can all go back to the way things were as before. And I am passionately against this position because I think it's extremely dangerous for this world of ours. However,
le souffle de la crise étant moins chaud aux oreilles de certains,
the storm of the crisis for some seems to have been ridden, and therefore for some it seems to be less urgent to take decisions than was the case 2 years ago, because they believe that things will sort themselves out by themselves. Last point. We identify 3 major risks for this year 2011, even though we may be far more optimistic than we were. The first is the issue of sovereign debt. We have to cut down or reduce deficits, so we have to implement reforms. The world cannot continue simply continuing to mount up these staggering debts without thinking about the imbalances that they engender, and I will answer any questions you may have on the subject. The second point, or second risk, is monetary imbalance, financial imbalances, which have increased 5-fold over the last few years, and which one day, one of these days, will bring down the whole pack of cards unless we attend to this very swiftly and very strongly. To put it in a nutshell, the context of who weighs heavily on the economic scene has changed completely, and yet the monetary system has remained exactly as it was. It didn't need to adapt. In a sense, we haven't had an international monetary system since 1971. Is this good for heads of corporation? Is this good for those of us who want and who are calling for growth? Is it good I personally have very strong views on the subject. And on the third point, which again I will give you explanations about, the risk on inflation and for growth of the soaring prices of commodities, the extreme volatility of the cost of raw materials and commodities. A year ago, in 6 months, the barrel of Brent dropped from $140 to $40. Now, it's in no one's interest for that to be the case. It's in no one's interest to see hunger riots break out in various countries simply because people cannot feed themselves and their families. And it's not even in the interest of those who are producing commodities, be they fossil fuels or food commodities. So this is the agenda that we have set for the G20. This is our program. I fully see the risks, but I think there is less risk in talking about in addressing real issues than in spending an entire year to talk about everything and anything except what really matters. And in saying that, all I am doing is applying the rules which in your corporations, your companies, the companies you run, you abide by day after day. We cannot afford to turn a blind eye to the real issues that are threatening the world's economic future. We cannot afford to do that. And it is with this deeply held belief that France will try and organize a useful presidency of the G8 and of the G20. I do not want to be too lengthy, so I will simply now answer whatever questions you may have as frankly as I can.
Monsieur le Président, merci.
Mr. President, thank you for outlining those issues. I'm going to follow up immediately with a question. You said that the global growth is currently at around 5%. There's a real return of optimism, which we can feel. Does that not make your job a lot more difficult? You yourself mentioned the fact that if your back is against the wall, you have no choice. It's easy to act. But now we have to build the future, not only leave the crisis behind us. Now, under these circumstances, do you believe that there is the political will amongst your partners to involve themselves in this immense task which you are looking to undertake?
Écoutez, nous sommes au 21e siècle depuis bientôt 11 années.
You know, we entered into the 21st century, 11 years ago already? And we are still functioning according to the rules in the organization of the 20th century. I have manifold examples of this. I have always considered that it was madness, that there should not be a single African country holding a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Africa represents 1 billion inhabitants. 30 years down the road, it will represent 2 billion inhabitants. Now, this is an organization and a way of thinking and of doing things that belongs to the 20th, not the 21st century. I also think that it's totally unreasonable that the South American continent, which has undergone extraordinary demographic growth, an additional 500 million inhabitants, should not either have a seat on the Security Council on a permanent basis. But what should I even say about India? In 20 or 30 years' time, it'll be the world's most populous country, and nor is India holding a permanent seat at the Security Council of the United Nations. And likewise, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico. This doesn't make any sense. Now, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Bretton Woods, which is right next door to New York, held a one-year meeting. 1 year it took, in order to set up a monetary system Now, at the time, there was only one economy, and that is not being insulting to anyone. It was the American economy. It's the only one that counted, and therefore only one currency, the dollar. Now, who in this room would be so bold as to stand up and tell me that in 2011, as we stand here today, the world we face has anything to do with the world that we faced in 1945? Who could possibly claim that? Who could possibly have the nerve to say that? Now, I say this to our friends across the Atlantic, and you know how deeply attached I am to the partnership and friendship that we have with the USA. Nobody wants to weaken the dollar. Nobody wants to weaken the dollar. The world needs the dollar. The dollar is there. It will continue to be the world's #1 currency. 62% of the world's currency reserves are in dollars. 82% of trade is in dollars worldwide. But just let me ask you this question. Dominant currency doesn't necessarily spell single-only currency. Do you consider, you who are so open-minded and open to the world, that the RMB has no importance and no clout, that the yuan doesn't exist? And is it not natural that each, I'm thinking of the Japanese, the Chinese, the Americans, should act in terms of their currency in many ways, and oftentimes unilaterally, if there is no multilateral system or multilateral way of handling their currency. They cannot be criticized for that. There isn't even a forum, believe it or not, a place where currencies are discussed, the only place where currencies, I'm not talking about central banks and central banker meetings, but, you know, currency is not simply an economic issue. It is, in the truest sense of the word, a trade and policy and political issue. The only forum since 1975 where this issue was discussed was the G7, which has become the G8. And I happen to challenge the legitimacy of the G7, now the G8, speak about currency for a simple reason, which is that China is not a member of the G8. How can we possibly say to China, be careful about your surpluses, beware about the value of your currency, whereas they are not even present or represented in the only forum that discusses the issue. And I stand to be corrected by my Minister of Finance, Christine Lagarde, who is going to be participating in the Minister of Finance G8 summit with her usual talent. It makes no sense. Special drawing rights, I believe, was created, 40 or 42 years ago, something like that, 4 decades ago. SDRs are what? A basket of currencies. Is the Chinese currency in that? Of course no. Is that the way we should continue? Since 1990, the world has undergone 42 crises of capital flights. In other words, 42 times since 1990, countries have literally seen their capital fly out of the window. And we're not interested in that, and we're not going to do anything about that. Do we think that's all fine and dandy? Now, in order to counter such risk, these countries build up huge reserves in currencies at huge cost. Are we to accept that and do nothing? And look at Seoul. Our Korean friends remarkably chaired the G20. But in terms of image, the misunderstanding, at least one part of the media, or at least this is what came out in the media, between the G2, China and the US, do you think that was good or bad for world affairs and world trade? Do you think that is the way we should continue? Should we continue pointing accusing fingers at each other for such and such a surplus and such currency reserve? And how could we possibly criticize a country for wanting to export? Because that's exactly what all of us want to do, increase our exports. So, Professor Schwab, I am putting my money, as it were, on the intelligence of my colleagues their ability to understand that if these imbalances continue, it will be to the detriment of one and all, and that each of us has to take a step forward, move towards the positions of others in order to build the architecture of this 21st century of ours. Now, I'm not crazy. I know that we're not going to define in the space of 1 year a new international monetary system. I know that full well. But at least let's just lay the foundations. No one is calling for a return to fixed exchange rates. That stands to reason. But at least let's discuss these issues. Let's talk about them. Let's try and find answers to these questions. Let's put an end to instability. You and what you do need stability. How could you possibly have that if there isn't a framework in which to achieve that stability? Yes, Professor, it is more difficult. But it is all the more urgent and indispensable. And I think that if that is the way we address these topics and issues, then we will enable everyone to make a contribution to building the future. If all we do is point accusing fingers at one another, criticize one another, then we will simply grind to a halt, get gridlocked, and we'll see what the fallout is. You know, G20 is attracts between 8,000 and 10,000 journalists over 2 days. Do you think it's really reasonable that with these 10,000 journalists watching us, it's reasonable to spend 2 days discussing just about nothing and coming up with just about nothing? I've known for years now that it's in the eye of the cyclone that the situation actually is at its calmest.
Mr. President, in the room, as we saw in the discussions yesterday, there are certainly people who would express doubt about the capacity of the euro to last in the long term. How would you respond to these euro who have doubts about the capacity of the euro to survive? And this is a second question, what could the role of the euro be in a reformed monetary system which you are developing a vision of?
Yes, I know. Some people doubts about the ability of the euro to survive. I mean, it occupied many articles over many weeks and months, and yet these articles we can't find anymore, and the euro is still there. I remember 8 months ago reading the euro is sentenced to death, it will never resist, it will never survive, it will succumb, and yet the euro is there, isn't it? It has survived, has it not? And I want to say something very simple to you. Just that, but be it Chancellor Merkel or myself, never, and listen to me carefully here, never will we turn our backs on the euro. We will never drop the euro or abandon the euro. And for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with Europe than those of you who are Europeans, there is something very important for you to understand. And that is that the euro spells Europe. The euro is Europe. And Europe has spelled 60 decades, 60 years of peace on our continent. Therefore, we will never let the euro go or be destroyed. And I involve, and I speak as much to my German friends as I do for my fellow French citizens, because we and the Germans were locked 3 times in the most horrific, barbaric wars. And that wasn't in the Middle Ages, it was yesterday, the day before yesterday. Now, if Europe has become the world's most peaceful, most stable continent, it is because we, I mean not Chancellor Merkel and myself, but our predecessors, built the European Union. And the very fact that 17 countries should have availed themselves of the same currency is a magnificent symbol of that. And to imagine that we might pull out, that we might abandon the euro, is to show a complete misunderstanding, misapprehension of the state of mind of Europeans who have been at each other's throats for centuries and who now aspire to one thing only, and that is lasting peace. So for us, it's not simply an economic or monetary issue. It has to do with our identity as Europeans. For those who wish to wager against the euro, and against the euro, be careful how you invest. We are determined to ensure the strength of the euro in a structural manner. We have done very difficult things. You have to understand 17 countries have to be got to agree. Now, I admire President Obama because when he takes a decision, he has to get the White House and the Congress to agree. But we in Europe, when we take a decision, we have to get 17 countries to agree with different traditions and histories, and often in a situation of urgency. Now, what we've done is to set up a mechanism to defend the euro. What we did for Greece, we had to do very speedily, very fast, and that is what enabled us to support and come to the rescue of the countries that were under attack and the economies that then were under attack. And Chancellor Macron and I would like to go even further because both of us believe very firmly that we have to further deepen and integrate economic policy in Europe in a spirit of coordination and competitiveness. So, Professor Schwab, what I would have to say on the subject of the euro is a very simple one, a very basic one. It is of such importance that we will be there whenever it needs to be defended. The results, the consequences of a failing or disappearance of the euro first would be so cataclysmic we can't even possibly entertain the idea, not even play with the idea of entertaining the idea. Now, have I been clear enough? Maybe I haven't been clear enough.
Monsieur le Président, Klaus Schwab m'a fait le
Mr. President, Klaus Schwab has given me the high honor of being able to chair a discussion with my president. I hope that you will be patient with me. Allow me to begin by identifying a slight contradiction. You said it would be easy to keep this promise. Now, of coming to Davos, I know that you're just coming for this session today. And I don't think, despite the blue skies, that it wasn't as easy as you say it was to come to Davos, and we all are deeply grateful that you have made it. In the World Economic Forum, together with the International Chamber of Commerce, we have established a task force with the ambition, the sole ambition, of feeding this process of reflection. It's not putting itself into competition with those that already work in this area. It has as its overriding goal to make a modest contribution to this debate. We will have 10 or so people who will be asking a question or making a comment on the issues of the G20, which you have just outlined. Now, to allow us to continue with French, the language of Molière, I'm going to begin with Gérard Sirlier, who has no need of an introduction. He is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of GDF Suez, and he's going to be talking about the volatility of commodity prices and how to counter that volatility. Gérard, you have the floor. Good morning, President of the Republic. I am President or CEO of GDF Suez France, which works in the energy sector. You have chosen amongst your priorities or the priorities of the G20, the question of countering the volatility of the price of commodities, agricultural commodities, mineral and energy commodities. We believe that this is a major issue for our economies, for our companies, and our peoples as well. On the issue of energy prices, gas, oil, coal, and also carbon dioxide, I'd like to dwell on this for an instance. The prices have doubled over the last 10 years and reached unprecedented levels, apart perhaps if we think back to the time of the oil crisis. This volatility, this atmosphere of uncertainty creates difficulties for investors. It hampers investors. And in our sector, in the energy sector, electricity and energy prices in general require high levels of capital. And any level of uncertainty will hobble investment. The long-term effect could be to create new bottlenecks and perhaps further impact on prices. So we believe that there is a connection, a relationship between the risk of price hikes, the volatility, and an atmosphere of uncertainty. Now, a number of points have been addressed, and we would support measures to strengthen, enhance dialogue between producer and consumer countries, transparency on the flows of energy, volumes, stocks, consumption, and transparency as well in terms of the long-term decisions which are being taken, as well as transparency on the decisions to manipulate markets. Now, these are initiatives that need to be followed. Further, I'd just like to say one thing about carbon dioxide, which has become an essential commodity in the area of the energy markets. The uncertainties which exist today on the future price of CO2 could create difficulties in Europe for investment. We could see shortfalls in investment and therefore in the long term systemic problems in the European energy market. So, Mr. President, a few comments on these issues, and it would be extremely useful to understand the orientations which you will pursue with the G20. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me reassure those who are worried about this. France is not challenging the role of the market. It's not challenging the marketplace, because there again we've read some pretty astonishing things written in different media. What is the market? It's simply supply and demand set within the framework of a certain number of rules. If there's no rules, there's no market. A market without rules that is not regulated is not a market. A market that is over-regulated is a dead market. But the total absence of rules, it does not spell a free market economy. Now, what's happening? It still happens that the huge hike in agricultural commodity prices is due to a huge increase in demand. If we want to feed our people by 2050, we will have had to, worldwide, have been able to produce 70% more agricultural produce. And let me say in passing to my European friends that this is the last moment we should be thinking about dismantling the common agricultural policy. But anyway, going back to this issue of food production and energy production. Why, for instance, why would you accept regulation on financial secondary markets and not for the same to apply to commodity prices? The Russians and the Ukrainians who've had to face huge forest fires and drought, when they decided as a result of this last year no longer to export their grain to the Maghreb countries, no agricultural organization was in a position to have the foggiest clue about what level the stock stood at. That is grain stocks. So the lack of transparency plus lack of regulation led to 6% increase in commodity prices in the matter of a few weeks. And I've seen in the press a number of interesting surveys and articles in the press saying that speculation has nothing to do with price increases. I mean, it's a chicken and egg situation. Speculation feeds on shortages, and shortages are made worse by speculation. Take the example of cocoa. The very fact that a speculator can, in one simple put, acquire 15% of world cocoa production without having to pay a single cent for the actual amount of cocoa that he's just bought, and sell that cocoa off before he's even paid for the original purchase. Is that natural? Is that normal? Is that acceptable? Is that what a market should look like? And should we continue like that? And I say to countries like India, Brazil, who are producing food commodities, that there is no question of preventing them from benefiting from price increases. I understand that. All I'm saying is, hey, be careful. If there is exponential increase in prices, there generally is exponential drop in prices. And that will kill off your peasants and your farmers and your agriculture. Are we right to regulate or not? I went with Gordon Brown, to whom I was with Gordon Brown, and I wish to pay tribute to him. One of the few people who actually said to the oil-producing countries that it was not reasonable for the barrel of Brent to stand at $140, that actually this was going to endanger their production on a long-term basis because it would encourage countries that didn't have fossil fuels to invest more in alternative sources of energy. Likewise, it was not more reasonable to have a barrel of Brent standing at $40. We need regulation, not excessive regulation. We need regulation because the regulation means transparency. Let he who purchases large amounts of commodities pledge to, say, put down a part, a percentage, a portion of the money, and that be held as a guarantee. I mean, we've seen levels of shortages that unheard of since 1974 for some food commodities. And the day we have hunger and riots, do you think that is going to contribute to stability? The farmers worldwide can no longer feed their cattle because grain prices have so shot up. Is that reasonable? Isn't there some sense in organizing the market between those who are producing and those who are purchasing, the supply and the demand? That is all France is asking for. It seems perfectly reasonable. And it seems to me that this is one of the major risks that may hinder world growth. Because we've never seen growth without energy. That is what, Mr. Mistralet, we are trying to do without becoming obsessed with what I was talking about, the chicken and egg. Is it all about speculation? Is it all about shortages? Let us leave that aside. Let us just calmly, quietly set up some reasonable rules so that we can have a market that functions normally and no one can upset the basic rule of supply and demand. I think that makes simple sense.
Mr. President, we'll continue with the problems of regulation. One of the important subjects relates to the regulation of the financial system. I'm going to ask Jimmy Dimon, who is the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan Chase, to comment on the issues of financial regulation, and that will be in English.
Mr. President, thank you for coming here today. And when you go to the G20, the things I would try to keep in mind are all of these problems are fixable. The world is strengthened dramatically already, though I agree with your comment, it's not a given that that strength will continue. And the policy, good policy, is critical to making it work. I think the single sole objective should be jobs. My friend Mr. Lévy has mentioned it. It's for political reasons, but even more than that, for ethical reasons. We need to do everything we can to get jobs back, which means growth. And good policy is important. There was a book written about the last major crises called This Time is Different. People generally say that the outcome is that there's a financial crisis. It took a long time getting in. It'll take a long time getting out. I don't personally believe that that's true. I think if we have good policy, it can be much shorter. If you read that book carefully, very often the reason it took so long getting out is because of bad policy. Sometimes unintended, sometimes policy out of anger, but it's hard. We have to make sure we do the right things. We had an unprecedented financial crisis, and I honestly think had it not been for the active and quick movements of the governments around the world, it would have gotten worse. And so they are to be applauded for that. And I think it's very important we acknowledge the flaws. There were tremendous flaws in the financial system that needed to be looked at, analyzed, and fixed, and a lot of that has begun. In particular, higher capital and liquidity, resolution, which I prefer to call bankruptcy for big dumb banks. You have to be able to take down a big bank in a way that doesn't damage the population and the citizens. I personally think that cost of that should be charged back to banks. Just like in the United States, the cost of taking down banks is borne by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corp, but it's charged back to the banks. I think that's completely appropriate to protect the citizens. But so much has been done already. More capital, more liquidity, resolution, oversight, derivatives to clearinghouses. The market has already put less leverage in the system. The shadow banking system, where it's not gone, is no longer in the shadows, is perfectly out. There's far more transparency. There's far more better accounting. I think it would be important when we go to the G20, when it comes to financial reform, that people take a deep breath. A lot's been done. There's a huge cumulative amount. Too much will be too much. I know that people always say, well, bankers are talking their own book. They've got nothing about bankers. This is about jobs. I think business and banks can be part of the solution. In fact, I would urge the population to stop talking about banks like they're all one. They're not. There are many banks in this crisis who were pillars of strength in the storm. And I'm going to mention some European, HSBC, Standard Chartered, and hundreds around the world who in the time of crisis stood up and did what they can to help and not to make money or be greedy, etc. We've got to get these policies right. And at one point, the conversations have become a little shrill between regulators and banks. We need facts and analysis, and that will be part of the solution if we do it right. Thank you.
Bon, faut-il des banques pour faire tourner l'économie?
Well,
Oui.
do we need banks for the economy to function? Well, obviously, it goes without saying.
Souvenons-nous ce qui s'est passé.
But let us just think back to what actually happened. Everything was fine and dandy. Everything was going well and
Les
smoothly.
perspectives étaient exceptionnelles.
Prospects were exceptional, as a matter of fact.
Et puis un jour,
And then, one fine day,
l'incroyable s'est produit.
the unthinkable occurred. Have we already
Une des
forgotten?
grandes banques
One of the
américaines
major American
a
banks
fait faillite.
went bankrupt. It went under.
Ce n'est incriminer personne,
And then
ce n'est
it's not
insulter personne, mais
insulting anyone or incriminating anyone, but just let's remember how this all began. I mean, we haven't forgotten, not 2 years after the event.
et le monde stupéfait
And the world was
a vu une des 5 grandes banques
gobsmacked to see
s'effondrer
one of the
comme un
5 major
champion
American
de
banks literally implode like a pack of cards.
Ce que personne ne
What
pensait
no one
imaginable
had
était
thought
sous
was
nos yeux.
imaginable was actually happening in front of our very eyes. And the banking system, which, sir, depends on one single word, rests on one single word, which is trust, confidence.
Tout d'un coup, les épargnants
All of a
du
sudden,
monde entier se sont
the
dit, au fond,
People worldwide
est-ce
who
que
had
je peux avoir
savings
confiance?
suddenly
Et
started
à partir
thinking,
de ce moment-là,
should I
nous étions
trust?
quelque part en
Can I
septembre
afford to trust?
2008.
So we're talking about September 2008.
Tout a commencé à s'écrouler.
Everything started to
Et le
collapse.
monde l'a payé de dizaines de
And
millions
the cost
de
to the
chômeurs
world
qui
had
n'étaient
been tens
pour
of millions
rien,
of unemployed who had
absolument
nothing
rien,
to do,
et qui
nothing to
pourtant
do
payaient tout.
with this. And yet, who are the ones to foot the bill? In the harshest
Entre
possible
le
fashion.
château de cartes qui s'écroule,
Because between the pack of cards that came down when Lehman Brothers
les
went
chômeurs
under
européens,
and
américains,
the
japonais,
European,
chaque pays du
American,
monde, il y a un lien
Japanese
absolument
unemployed or wherever in the world, there is
Ça
absolutely
a
no
créé
link.
beaucoup de colère, Monsieur le Président,
Now, sir, it generated a lot of anger, a lot of
et beaucoup de
anger,
souffrance.
and a lot of suffering and
Et puis
anguish.
sont venues les
And
explications.
then
Et qu'est-ce qu'on a vu?
explanations started pouring out.
Qu'au fond,
And what did we see?
depuis
Well,
10 ans,
we saw that for the last 10
des
years,
institutions majeures
major institutions
en qui on pensait pouvoir avoir confiance
whom we thought we could trust
faisaient des choses
were actually engaged
qui n'avaient rien à
in
voir
doing
avec le
things that
strict
had
bon sens.
absolutely nothing to do with what I would simply call
C'est ça qui
common
s'est passé.
sense.
Pardon.
That's, I'm sorry to be so blunt, and I'm sure, and simplistic, and I'm sure there are far more talented people in the room who can explain things more cogently than I,
Que
but
s'ils sont effondrés,
this is my way of explaining
c'est parce
things.
qu'ils gagnaient beaucoup
If
d'argent
they collapsed, it's because they were
avec
making
des
a lot
produits
of
qu'ils ne
money
gagnaient pas eux-mêmes.
by selling off products which were not generating money themselves. In other words, you were making profits on the debts that you were selling. So, this pass-the-parcel game, which of course was very interesting because everyone you passed the parcel on made money. Well, in the end, there was no one to pass the parcel to. And everyone thought that this was an excellent idea, but it wasn't profitable. And then the whole thing collapsed. So what did we decide at the G20? We decided that henceforth there should never be a single institution that should not have honest regulation and rules, which does not prevent flexibility. So I share your point of view. We do need flexibility. But, you know, between flexibility and the scandalous things that we saw and discovered and learned about, there is a huge gap. And I would not like to be perceived as someone who is obsessive about regulation. I am calling for regulation in areas where we should have had rules long ago. There were extraordinary things happening. This idea of off-balance sheet is probably one of the most extravagant, hair-raising things that I've ever come across. So you, bankers and heads of corporation, had to respect a rule for everything that was on your balance sheet. But you could take off your balance sheet just about what you wanted. So what's the point of having a rule? I mean, if you can simply circumvent them. And if they're full of loopholes. I'm not challenging the principle of securitization. It so happens that I believe that securitization is essential for the world's development. But there must be a limit. If X or Y offshore country were to guarantee 700 times its GDP, are we talking about a market economy, or are we simply talking about a madhouse? So, I really want to say this. I don't have issues, sir, with flexibility. Bonuses. Take bonuses. I don't have a problem with bonuses. On condition that there is a counterpart. In other words, a drawdown, some kind of sanction. Otherwise, you've got a system where when things are going well, the list of reasons why things are going well is easy to identify, and those who made things go well are easy to identify, and not the reverse. Those who in 2007 got bonuses, and even in 2008, when things started collapsing, should have been sanctioned. There's nothing wrong with bonuses, but they have to be spread over time to make sure and to ensure that the profits that have been rolling in over 1 year are indeed long-term profits. Now, I see the risk you mentioned. If there's too much regulation, you see the risk of what you call shadow banking developing. I understand that, but by the same token, hedge funds who were purchasing incredible things at any price in order to sell them off at ridiculous prices. Who footed the bill for that? The wretched taxpayers. It was a game of Russian roulette with our money, with our savings. Now, I'm keenly aware of the matter and the need to strike the right balance. You know, being French, and talking to an American or to a British banker, I'm necessarily perceived as somewhat suspect. But I'm not being accusatory here. But don't be accusatory of us. We will be reasonable, we will be wise, but believe you me, we will be determined. And those tax havens, believe you me, where any amount of money could be simply stashed away. This is something we are going to continue to pursue. And one of the things we're going to do is to ensure that the commitments that we have entered into have been actually implemented. It's one thing to make promises, it's another one to keep them. It's a matter of ethics. I mean, maybe the word shocks you, but it seems strong. There cannot be a market economy if it does not function in an ethical manner. There cannot be likewise rules or markets if there are not a minimum set of rules. That is the line that we are going to tread, the path we're going to tread.
Mr. President, you also spoke about the reform of the monetary system, and Peter Sands, who is the Group Chief Executive of Standard Chartered Bank, will be putting his question. Peter, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I'm on the other side of the hall. You've just discussed with my counterparts at JP Morgan some of the issues surrounding the regulation of banks, and I actually think much has been achieved and much needed to be changed in the regulation of banks to make them more resilient, better governed, better able to withstand shocks. But you have, quite rightly, I think, put focus for the French presidency not only on completing that task, but on addressing some of the wider stability issues within the financial system. So the issues around global imbalances, commodity prices, as we talked about, a much broader set of issues. And I do think this is an essential part of the equation. We have to make individual financial institutions stronger, but we also have to make the system stronger. And as yet, that second task, we probably haven't made enough progress on. My question to you, Mr. President, is how best can the financial community, financial institutions, engage with the policy community on this second task? I believe we have a role to play in helping not just make ourselves stronger, but making the system stronger. And I would very much welcome your advice on how best we can engage. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, I'd like to give you two examples in responding, rather than engaging in an ideological battle on the subject of who is earning too much and who is spending too much. With Christine Lagarde, we have set ourselves a very specific objective, sir, which is, for a start, to agree on what constitutes an indicator in order to gauge or measure imbalance. I don't like us talking about imbalances in too general terms, because if you come back, because that brings us straight back to ideology, and I think we have to be pragmatic and not ideological. Now, what are the relevant indicators that enable us to define world imbalances? Is it balance of payments, budgets, budget deficits? What is it? There are different criteria. Of course, it's a difficult objective that we've set ourselves, but this is what we're going to try and do. As of February, we're going to try and bring about a convergence of G20 countries on a whole host of indicators that are relevant to define and measure imbalances. I was not entirely in agreement at Seoul, where there was so much talk about, above the 4% level of surpluses, you must be sanctioned. I don't agree with that. So the first thing we need to do is a very difficult one, which is to have a list of indicators in order to define and gauge imbalances. Then, having done that, what we next need to do is this, or answer the following question. Who is going to make sure, A, that they're calculated, and B, that they are implemented? Now, from the point of view of the French presidency, maybe I'm sticking my neck out here, there is only one international organization that is relevant, that is the one where these criteria should be applied. It is the IMF. Now, this may be a felicitous coincidence. The G20 is 20 members and 5 guests, apart from Spain that has a permanent seat. The other are not always the same. The IMF has 24 members. And they're not always the same ones, but anyway, within its governing bodies. So I think that it would be very useful to rethink the IMF's remit and statutes in order to perceive it and see it as the world forum in charge of coordinating macroeconomic policies, financial and monetary policies. It seems to me that the IMF would be better playing its role in doing that job than by looking at the wage bills of one of the world's most poorest countries in Africa, which in any case, even if the wage bill were to be too high, would not in any way contribute to worsening world imbalances. So whatever we do, I think we have to extend and broaden the role of the IMF in combating these imbalances. So we have two objectives. We define these criteria and we then apply them by changing the remit and the terms of reference of the IMF.
Mr. President, you have been extremely generous with your time, and I think we have to close very shortly. We unfortunately cannot give the floor to everyone, but perhaps we could ask Laurence Parisot, with your permission, to make a last statement before Klaus Schwab perhaps will put one last question as well. Good morning, or good afternoon rather, Mr. President. A few months ago, you presided over a wonderful Africa-France summit, and you made sure that the links with Africa and aid given to Africa be at the center of the concerns of the G8 and G20 that you are the president of. Now, Africa is very coveted. You said yourself that in Africa we will have 1 billion more inhabitants in about 30 years' time. And you've also linked your statement about aid to Africa with a tax to be imposed on financial transactions. We can see that there might be incredible development thanks to the public-private partnerships that may become more numerous, but this is also linked to governance problems and issues of corruption. Now, do you think, Mr. President, that these public-private partnerships, these PPPs, could be an addition to your vision of this tax on financial transactions, or could it take their place if such a tax could not be introduced? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam. Well, this is probably one of the topics where there's the least agreement within the G20, and yet which, in my view, is so obvious that we should be able to reach consensus. Let me spell this out. In Copenhagen, the world's major countries took a decision, which was to pay to the world's poorest countries $120 billion per annum as of 2020. Now, as we are all running budgetary deficits, there is no one who in their wildest dreams can imagine that this could come out of state coffers. Therefore, we have no choice. If we want to keep our word, if we want to go back on our word, and I will be next Sunday in Addis Ababa as a guest of the African Union Summit in order to defend this idea, we need innovative financing mechanisms. It isn't a matter of choice, it's a matter of obligation. Or let us sleep well at night. And the day that half of the world's population that has no access to energy, electricity, development, infrastructure or food actually goes down into the streets and starts marching, it will be too late. So it's as simple as that. I say this as a European. I mean, Europe is 12 kilometers away via the Straits of Gibraltar from Africa. But I say this also for all developed countries that will not be able to handle migratory flows that will simply be impossible to handle if we do not keep our promises. Now, there are different forms that this innovative financing could take. I personally remain attached to the idea of a tiny level levy on financial transactions, but there are other possible systems. It's something I will certainly put on the table of the G20. I know that a certain number of our friends and colleagues are against, and they are entitled to be against. But what I will suggest then is that we set up a small group of leading countries, as it were, lead countries, in order to implement these innovative financing mechanisms and stand by our word. And I have no doubt that a few years later, other countries will toe our line. Because, you know, Africa has its eyes firmly trained on us. And Africa can perfectly well see the difference between golden promises and those who actually put their money where their mouth is. So yes, these innovative financing, or public-private partnerships, are an important contribution, can be an important contribution, but we cannot circumvent the issue of innovative financing. Now, I talked about 1 billion inhabitants in Africa, 500 million of whom are under the age of 17. No social protection, no infrastructure, no access to energy. Do you really believe that we can imagine a stable world if things go on like this? Now, of course, I'm not saying that innovative financing is the solution to everything. It's not the panacea. How do we do things? How do we handle them? We'll think about that. But it's a step in the right direction. I mean, is it reasonable to leave these ideas up to unreasonable people? Have we not been witnessing the rise in terrorism that feeds on poverty, of fanaticism that feeds on injustice? Do we really think that we're going to be able to forge ahead with half of humanity that lives very well, thank you very much, and the other that isn't even able to survive? And I say this here in Davos because I believe that I'm talking to intelligent, smart people who actually think and who know that these things can't go on like that. And this vision that I call for is not simply to look at what's going on tomorrow morning or the next leap or bound in the stock market. I'm thinking about 20, 30 years ahead, about a world which will not look in any way like the world in which we live in, a world where information circulates at the speed of light, and which will simply not allow such injustice. When it took 3 months for news to reach Europe from India, perhaps one could imagine one had some time to play with, but it's no longer the case. It takes a nanosecond. And I want us to think about this. Injustice. Light is shed on injustice because information is at our fingertips immediately, which makes it all the more urgent for us to take decisions. And it makes it all the more impossible to stomach when one sees the opulence of some and the poverty of others. But the future of your children, your grandchildren, your countries rests on our ability to redress these imbalances. And if we can't even come up with an innovative financing mechanism which would represent a minute levy on financial transactions, which could then be channeled to those economies that could then be in a position to buy the products that you manufacture, because that'll be the fallout for you. If we don't have the wisdom to anticipate that, then you will see that the most reasonable governments that govern these poor countries will be swept away, and the world will look like a very different place to what it looks like right now. And it is my duty in the presidency of the G8 or the G20 to raise this issue. I know that as soon as I talk about innovative financing, everyone who dislikes taxes, everyone dislikes taxes, I dislike taxes, say, no, we'll never do this, this will never work. But, you know, we live on the same planet. You and I live in the same world, and this huge gap, these huge gaps will jeopardize not simply growth, but the very future of your companies and our societies. It's not a question of ideology. It has got to do with the way we think the world is going and what we think it should look like in 20 or 30 years' time. We're talking about imbalances that are not simply monetary. Yes, we need to think about them. And we need to think above all about these financing mechanisms that will entitle people to pull themselves out of poverty in the same way as we, years back, centuries back, were given the opportunity to pull out of poverty as a result of the Industrial Revolution. It is not simply a matter of ethics. It is a matter of wisdom, of common sense, to have new ideas and not stick with the old but threadbare ideas of the past century. These are some of the issues that we're going to discuss at the G8, G20. I could have raised others. Civilized internet. Again, this makes common sense. The idea is not to bridle internet, it's not to restrict internet, which is a fantastic tool in this digital world of ours. But how can we civilize internet? How do we deal with the issue of taxation of digital society? How do we protect ourselves from terrorism via internet? It's not because we are in favor of freedom of information that any old terrorist group should be entitled to put on an internet site or blog the instructions as to how to build a bomb. It's not an offense to internet or to the development of personal private freedoms to say that. Internet is one of the greatest revolutions that mankind has ever seen. And at the G8, we're going to invite the major protagonists on the digital scene to give their views on the subject. And if I've come here, it's not simply to talk about 2011. It's because I have a responsibility as a head of state, which is to imagine the future, just as you as bankers and heads of corporations have to think about the future of your companies 20, 30, 40 years down the line, insofar as possible. When you make decisions to invest, you do so not for the past, but for the future. And for me, it's the same thing. So, just to say, well, innovative financing is yet another tax or levy, and therefore I'm against it, is being completely blind. We need to look towards the future. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you so much. I must say that this discussion here reflects and indicates very clearly that we need this partnership. The major issues do not just concern politics and policymakers, but it's the economy as well, the simple citizen, the man in the street, the unemployed that are concerned by this. So we promise to give you all the support we can in your endeavors. Your presentation has so truly reflected the topic of this year's forum, finding new values in common for this new reality. That is exactly it. And I think this year, 2011, is the tipping point, is the turning point. If we as mankind are able to meet these challenges of the new reality and to build together the future, and not just fight the crisis, then we will have made steps forward. So I would wish you all the best of luck in your very important tasks and endeavors. Thank you very much.